Okay, I got a few more tips and stories here for you now. I talk about some stuff. I got one really good war story that was sent to me by a friend of mine. But to start with, I want to talk about these cooling system bleeders that you see. You know, this is on one of those 2.7 liter Chrysler Seabrings, and it's got that bleeder screw right up there on that housing that always has to be replaced because the housing leaks. And sometimes when you want to use this bleeder, it's locked up and you'll have to replace the housing because of that. And what you're supposed to do when you're using these bleeders, and not all vehicles have them, and you can on some of them. I have actually, like on some of your straight six engines, like on Jeeps, taken the heater hose off at the front of the head and poured coolant through the radiator neck until I saw it come up into the, you know, where it was trying to come out that neck for where I removed the heater hose, and then I'll put that back on there, and I get most of it out of there. Now the thermostats on these things, a lot of the times now, have got a little bleeder in them, so that the bleeder will actually let the air work its way out of there when you're filling it up and not cause so much of a problem by that. But if it has a bleeder, and you need to find out if it does, if there's a bleeder, you need to go find that bleeder, and what you're supposed to do most of the time is take that bleeder out and pour the coolant in until the coolant comes out of the bleeder, so all the air is gone. Now, you're not supposed to open the bleeder like somebody did in this photo with the engine running and it's trying to be hot. You know, I mean, occasionally somebody might do that, but the right way to do it is to open the bleeder and pour the stuff in there. You might notice this bleeder here, this particular bleeder here has got a little nipple. I mean, it's like a brake bleeder, so you can put a hose on it if you want to, so you won't make so much mess all over the engine. Here's another little thing. Whenever I'm working on a bearing noise, you know, it's really irritating sometimes how difficult it can be to track down bearing noises, because you may swerve to the right, you know, trying to load the left, and you may just feel like, oh, I'm sure it's this bearing here, and then you change this bearing, and it turns out it was the one on the other side, or the one on the back rear, or whatever, I mean on the right rear or something. But this guy that I know that runs a tire store said that when he's got some kind of a bearing noise that he thinks is going to smack him around, he goes ahead and sells them both of the bearings for that end of the vehicle. And I've actually run into that a few times myself, you know, where you just felt swear in a court of law that you knew which bearing it was, and it would be a different one. Well, it makes me feel a lot better if I can cut this thing apart and I can see this, you know, where it happened. And I've actually been in a situation where there was one Toyota, as I remember, that we put bearings on, and the only thing I could say, I replaced both the front ones. The one that wasn't noisy, the grease was a lighter color. It looked like some of that white colored lithium type grease, although it may not have been lithium. But the bearing that was making the noise didn't have brittling on it like you see on this one right here, but it did have issues with the grease was a different color and had tried to dry out a little bit. Of course, you know, those aren't really where you can pack them with grease. Once you take them apart, they're took apart, and then you can't really put them back together. Okay, so next thing, these metal parts that carry the loads, if they are not really smooth, you're going to have issues. You got that problem right here, see? Now, this corrosion right here, that's not usually a big deal. And I remember, you might remember a story I told about that, about this differential carrier that broke on this International Scout when I was working for a little while at the International dealer over here close by. That's back when Scouts were running around, and it was a four-wheel drive. And I asked the guys out this, whenever this thing started making racket back here, see, because that was letting this, that was allowing this gear here to not stay, you know, it wasn't spinning nice and, you know, on the plane that it's established by the bearing. And so I said, well, how long did you drive it? Because if that gear gets mismatched, I went the wrong way. If this gear gets mismatched with the pinion gear, then you're going to have noise. You're going to have whining and howling noises and all that kind of stuff will change with acceleration. Okay, so he said, no, I didn't drive it hardly any time. This part right here was the part that cracked, by the way, this, this here, and it was flopping around in there. So we got him a Terrier, and I put the ring gear on that Terrier, and I put everything back together, and I set it up like you're supposed to do. And that was the noisiest, whining rear end. And I said, good grief, he's going to have a ring gear and pinion too. And so my boss man said, go back to the back, and there's a rear end back there that's the same ratio that came out of another Scout. So then lay it back there a while and see if you can get the ring gear and the pinion out of that one and put it in there and see what that does. And when I opened it up, it was all rusty. And I'm talking about this gear, these teeth were all rust pitted. It was just awful. And so I said, well, this isn't going to be a waste of time because there's no way this is going to work. He said, just put them in there anyway. And so I went ahead and, brushed them off as good as I could and put everything together with new bearings and all that. And I set them up, sometimes you can use marking compound for, setting up the gears, whenever you're getting them like they're supposed to be. But anyway, I seem to be like I used grease for that one because you can do that too. And I got it set up, and I drove that thing, and with them old rusty pitted gears, even on these surfaces here and on the ring gear, because that rear end had been full of water back there, that thing still, so the quietest rear end, I don't know, it just blew me away how quiet it was after that. And so anyway, that turned out okay, but my goodness, what a gamble that was. However, he was paying me straight salary anyway, and so whatever he told me to do, I typically just did it without question because he was the boss, Now this right here, and I jumped forward to this slide accidentally a minute ago, is if you see the distributor gear wearing out like this one right here did, that's what it's supposed to look like, obviously. If you see the distributor wearing out, I've seen these vehicles come in that had smacked people around because they couldn't figure out why they wouldn't start. And you pull the distributor cap off, and when you spin it over, the rotor's just sitting there. Because the gear's worn off, or either that or the pin is sheared or something like that. But if that right there, the distributor bottoming out can be because it's pushed down too tight on the oil pump, which is basically creating extra effort that's needed when it's trapped between this and the oil pump because of a tolerance stack up, and you tie the distributor down and it pushes that gear down so it's pinching it. The cam is moving too much back and forth while the engine's spinning, or while it's running. And then if the gear is too soft to begin with, but typically there's going to be some little something there that was going on that caused this. Like you can see if you pinch that between the oil pump when you put the distributor in, and it made it harder to turn. Over time, it's going to wear those teeth off. All right, now this vacuum stuff is pretty interesting. If you've done vacuum tests on engines, it's really interesting to see how this works right here. This one right here, if it's nice and steady, like this one right here is 18 to 21 or something like that. I used to tell my students 18 to 22. That's a nice healthy engine. Sometimes you'll measure cranking vacuum, which will be like 2 or 3 inches or whatever. This is inches of mercury, by the way. That's another story. If it's leaking intake manifold, it'll be low, but that's got to be a big intake manifold leak. You're not typically going to see a low vacuum unless you got a massive intake manifold leak, and if you got that, you're going to hear it anyway. All right, you look at your valve timing. If your vacuum is low, the valve timing, if you've got a distributor and you can adjust valve timing, late valve timing will give you low engine vacuum. I say that, not your distributor. Golly, that's your ignition timing. What a buffoon I was in saying that. Valve timing can be late and cause it. EGR flow can cause it. If you're looking at it idle and it's low and the intake manifold's hot to the touch, that can be EGR. Ignition timing can basically be a issue right there too. Sticking valve or misfire fluctuating needle, you're going to see it bouncing. You'll see the little bouncing whenever it's running and all that. And then if you've got clogged exhaust, when you give it the gas and hold it there, it stays down. If you want to see what this looks like, you can put the vehicle in gear, have somebody put it in reverse while the park brake's locked and they're holding the brake, and brake torque it while you're watching a vacuum gauge. You'll see what a clogged exhaust looks like. And these vacuum gauges are just a plain old vacuum gauge like you see with the hoses and the adapters and all that. You can buy those at the parts house. They don't cost very much. And you notice this is actually designed so you can check the fuel pump pressure on an old conventional fuel pump with it. I've actually used these kind of gauges, you know, to measure exhaust back pressure too, you know, with that special adapter that I built. Now on the 7.3 Power Stroke, this filter head up here, by the way, this filter head has got this little check valve in it. And whenever, this is a pump that's down in the valley between the heads, this fuel pump, and it's basically going to be delivering low pressure fuel to this. And whenever the, you know, the high pressure fuel system sends fuel, you know, this sends out these heads, because basically this is coming from the tank. You see what I'm saying? It's coming from the tank in here, and then it goes out to the pump through here. All right, and the filter is actually filtering. There's also a heater in there and all that. Well, that thing right there, I had one time that had low pressure. You might notice this returns back to the tank on those older ones, but the later ones, you know, didn't have it was a returnless thing on the later ones. But this spring right here, I had one of these that had low fuel pressure, and the pump had already been changed, and I found in this control head, I screwed that out, and I found out that that spring was distorted to the point of where it wasn't operating that little valve. That looks like something out of a carburetor, doesn't it? But anyway, that is found. That's the older one now. You know, see, that's the pressure right there's where you check the fuel pressure on this. You got a special adapter to do that. It looks like a regular fuel pressure adapter would work, but you got to have a special adapter for that power stroke. I don't know why they designed it that way, but they did. But anyway, that was just a little thing I remembered that I ran into. I had to replace that particular spring and all that. It seemed like I was able to order that at the time. Parts for some of these 7.3s, from what I understand, are getting really hard to find in places up in Canada and places like that. Now this one right here is one of the most interesting stories I've heard in a long time. It was at a shop that went out of business, and then another shop got it and put 3 more engines in it. The instrument cluster was looking at $230,000, almost 231. And the same problem is always present. They put 3 engines in it, and the problem stayed the same. The second shop sent it to this friend of mine because he fixes stuff other people can't fix. So he started out, he was listening to this popping out the intake. Like if anybody that's ever seen a camshaft lobe rounded off will remember how one will pop out the intake, pop, 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 and it's going to get worse when you accelerate it and all that. And he was having that kind of an issue on one cylinder. It's popping out the intake, which sounded like a, you know, camshaft issue or something. So he removed and grounded the plug wire one at a time to discover it, and the problem was on cylinder number 2. He isolated it to cylinder number 2, which is the wise thing to do. And when he hooked up the scope, he could tell cylinder number 2 was firing at a higher kilovolts than the rest of the cylinders on his scope when he accelerated the engine or snapped the throttle. And that, you know, camshaft exhaust lobes will typically cause that kind of thing, because if the exhaust has nowhere to go, what it'll do is it'll actually just pop back out in the intake, and you can actually, if it's got throttle body injection or carburetor, you can hold your hand above the carburetor and it'll splatter gas up on your, you know, on your hand sometimes, or it'll, you know, fire out there like a machine gun. Okay, so we went to the valve tray and found the components moving like they should. Found number 2 intake with 40 pounds on the seat, which is roughly half a spec. He had a way of measuring that. And so he just went ahead and put valve springs on there because he was trying to make sure that he did it right. You know, he was wanting to make sure he did everything just like he was supposed to do it. And he had an Escort, and I ran into this on a 302 in a brand spanking new, back in 1984 in a new Mercury Grand Marquis that had 302 in it, that was misfiring on cylinder number 3. Now, I wasn't popping back out the intake, but it was misfiring. And the old diagnostician over there, he said the only thing he could think of after he checked everything was they had a bad camshaft. And they got a camshaft, and I got the perfect circle camshaft they ordered from the parts store and laid it on the bench next to the one that I was taking out of that engine. I couldn't see any difference. But when I put that camshaft in there, that skip was gone. Well, this fella here, this friend of mine, he had seen this too. And so he went ahead and he got the camshaft out, and he even measured it with a dial indicator while it was in there, you know, and all that. And he thought he saw something, and he went ahead and put a camshaft in there, just, you know, because that seemed like the thing to do at the time, and he really didn't do any good. He had, you know, a profile issue that camshafts are too irritating to go into right here. So, everything he did, it stayed the same. But one of the things that you got to do, if you get laser focused on the problem that you're having, you can lose your, you know, get out of line and thinking, you know, you got to go back over everything that you know and say, look, it's got to be something here. And so he stood there and he stared at it for a while. And he thought, what if this engine had swallowed something during his life, or whether it be exhaust valve head? Well, that, you know, really didn't make any sense either, you know. And so, anyway, so there's an air fitting, an air injection reactor fitting that was right there on cylinder number 2. And he took that one out since it was skipping on cylinder number 2. When he took that fitting out, it left an open port, which made a lot of racket right there. But it stopped backfiring out the intake and not blowing fuel mist out of the throttle body anymore. So he had come to a conclusion. He had figured, well, when I take this out, it's not popping back out of the intake anymore. See, this was after going around Robin Hood's barn to get to this point, but who would have thought this anyway? You got to remember now, 3 engines had been put in this for this same problem, and none of them had fixed it. Okay? And so, what he decided to do was get a leaf blower, whenever, you know, he took the exhaust manifold off. And he got a leaf blower and blew air in here, and he got air out of this one and that one, but he got no air out of that one, which didn't make any sense. So he pulled this cover off of here, and he could see a cast iron a little bit of color variation. He cut the intake off right there, and that's what he found in the intake. The intake had been bad since it was brand new and had been cast that way. Now, what I don't understand is how in the world it got through so many different people. And I mean, did it come out of the factory this way? Because this is a 94 model, and this repair job, that was not very long ago. That's one of them crazy things. He cut the manifold into right between the 2 and 4 cylinders, and he felt like while he was cutting it, it was solid, you know, with his, high-speed cutter thing. And so the spot he chose to cut was nearly dead center of the blockage. And I put a manifold on it, and the truck ran just like it was supposed to. That's all that was wrong with it the whole time, you see. So that's pretty crazy. Anyway, here's another 94 Chevy story. I went one time to the Chevrolet place just to visit the guys over there, and they said, somebody put MSD ignition on this 94 Chevy truck, and this guy bought it. He wants the MSD ignition pulled off of it, and he wants it put back like it was when it was a new truck. And, you know, this was actually in the 2000s when these old ignition systems were kind of a thing of the past, and not many people took them as a Chevrolet dealer anymore. And they couldn't get any spark out of it, even after they put the distributor and all this. This harness right here goes from the ignition module to the coil. And it's basically just a little pink and a white wire. It's about 6 or 7 inches long, because you know, the coil's not very far from the module on this truck. And so they had worked on that thing for a while, and so I took and wired the module up on the bench and fired it, you know, using my little tricks that I do, you know, and it fired just fine. And so we got to investigating this, and what we ran into was this particular wire here is supposed to be, look at this, this will confuse you. This is another connector that's similar to this, but it has a different shape. And on the connector it's marked A and B. But if you look, B goes to A, and A goes to B. See how A is going to B and B is going to A? Whoever built this harness, and it was a brand new harness they got out of the parts pipeline, had B going to B and A going to A. I don't know if whoever built it wasn't paying attention and was talking, or somebody else, or maybe they listened to their earbuds. I don't know what the deal was, but they built that harness wrong. So we borrowed a harness off of another vehicle that was built right and put it on there and fired that truck up. And so that was another 94 model. On that picture is not as clear as I wish it was. I took that picture at the dealership when we were fooling with that. But this right here was a noisy Honda Passport that belonged to one of my students. And whenever he was going to decide to put a timing belt on it, this is obviously not right, because you've got to pinch that thing in on a vise on the new one, you know, or if it's in good shape. And see that little hole? In that hole, you got to pinch that thing in and then stick like a drill bit or something really strong in there to hold that back. And then after you put your timing belt and everything on there, and you put this on there with it, you pull that pin out and it extends, and it's a real tight, hard thing. This one here was just flopping around, and that was one of the reasons he had so much noise. This guy was kind of funny. You know, I don't have anything against Honda cars, but his grandfather had sold him his Honda Passport when he was just out of high school, and told him that a Honda was the only car that anybody ever needed anywhere in the world at any time, and anybody that drove anything other than a Honda was an idiot. And so I said, well, let's just check that out. And so I went in there in my office with him, and I just did a random search, and I pulled up a website that was HondaSucks.com. I had nothing against Honda, but I was showing him not everybody loves Hondas as much as your grandfather does. You know, of course, Hondas are okay, and they do a lot of stuff right, you know, but anyway, this balancer comes apart. Sometimes you're going to have issues with that. Some of these engines, like on some of the Chryslers, will have a balancer that looks similar to this but has no keyway, and you got to pull it off there with a special puller and all that. But see that rubber in between that outside of this one? If the timing marks are on the outside of that thing, and usually they are, and this middle one turns, I mean, you can have the timing marks to where they're not telling you the truth about where the crankshaft is, or if you're setting the ignition timing and this outside piece is flipped a little bit, you're going to have some issues with that. And I've seen that a few times. This right here is one of those ridiculous aftermarket tensioners. You see how crooked that thing is down there? Look how crooked that is. And there was one particular brand of tensioner that I used to see that every time I bought one of those things, it didn't run very long before the belt started squeaking, and you would look and it would be out of line like that. Lousy aftermarket tensioners. That's what we were dealing with there. Alright, let me see if this thing will focus for me. Alright, this is my way of teaching basic electrical. I really like to have it where these guys have to wire everything up, because if they don't wire it up right, it won't work right. And so it's pretty, and the cool thing about it is when they get it wired up, they're only hooking it up one wire at a time, and that takes the mystery out of it, but you got to know where all the wires go. And this guy right here was in my program 20 years ago or something, and I took that picture on the table right there. Evidence of harmful resistance on a high current circuit. We used to see this right here, if I'm not mistaken, was on a Ford Contour, and I was working on at the dealership when I was working there. And these, there'll be some corrosion and stuff in these GM, these older GM engine controller connectors and stuff like that. You'll have issues with that. I've actually seen pin fit cause issues on these computer connectors. That and there's because of heat, like it was pulling the fan or something, you know. But one time there was an 06 Dodge Charger I was working on for a, we were actually working on a college for a student. And he had that thing in the Dodge place, and he'd spent a bunch of money over there trying to get that thing fixed, and they put all kinds of stuff on it, and he was still having a problem. And so I said, well, what we need to be looking at is the cam and the crank sensor while we're driving this 2006 Dodge. And so, because you could get it to do it fairly easy, you know. You turn in a curve a lot of times, it would stumble and die and stall and all that. It was scary and all, get out to drive. And I got some straight pins, and I back probed the connectors at the engine control. This was not the kind that had, but very similar to this, and little pins like that, kind of like that on that Dodge. And when I back probed the cam and the crank pins and hooked our scope up to it with the laptop, we hooked the pico scope up to it like that, and drove that thing all over the place looking at that scope pattern, and as long as we had that scope connected, it would never act up. So when we pulled the scope out of there, we pulled those pins out of there and started doing it again. And what we found out was, when we stuck those back probes, those connectors with those pins, it was pushing those pins over where they were making a better connection. And so he had a pin fit issue on that 2006 Charger. And that was the whole problem. It's kind of like going back to this, everybody's looked at this already, and they've run out of ideas, and it's obviously something they've missed, right? Alright, so let's move on to the next one here. Evidence of water intrusion. If you see water intrusion in any connector, particularly, like on a fuel pump or something like that. This right here was actually door lock switch. And the window buttons and the door lock switches have a tendency to get water in them because people have the window down sometimes when it's raining. It rains all over those. It works its way down in there, and then it oxidizes those terminals. And after a little while, these things don't work anymore. So that's basically another thing there. Now, whenever I'm reattaching a wire, I've showed you this picture before, to the terminal, I like to take and put that thing like that, and then after I put it like that where I've got it in there real snug like it's supposed to be, then I'll solder it. And after I soldered it, it'll snap you now. And anytime you're soldering this stuff, hold those terminals up so that whenever you're soldering it, there won't be any solder running up in here and messing the terminal up where it won't plug into anything. I had actually put this on a post forum, a forum post, and somebody said, why don't you just buy the cheap little replacement connector terminal? And I was thinking, boy, this guy hasn't been where I've been. You can't always get those connector terminals. I mean, unless there's a source for them that I don't know about. You know, because there's so many different kinds of connectors and so many different kinds of terminals. This one right here, clogging EGR ports on these engines always was interesting to me. How some of your Nissans are like that. You see that EGR port right there? That thing right there, there's one of those for each cylinder. Alright, and so what happens is if one of those, if all of them stop up but one, that one will be getting all the EGR, and when you crack the throttle and it starts flowing EGR, you'll get a misfire. It'll shut the injector down on a lot of them, and it'll fool you into thinking something's wrong with the injector because it quit clicking about the time it started skipping. And this right here was basically on a Ford Windstar when we did this one here. This is a Snap-on dynamic data collector. It's a Snap-on Sun, you know, they bought that. And Snap-on bought this company, and I had one of these things that the tool guy talked me into getting, and that darn thing was amazing to me, how all the stuff it would do. I can tell you a lot of stories about that thing. Let me back up here for a second. Alright, that thing right there actually had adapters you could rent from Snap-on, okay? Okay, so when you rented those adapters, look at that, you could have each one of these as a scope trace on the screen, or you could make it digital, or whatever, any way you wanted to display any of the available inputs. Now you had it was like a breakout box, and you would put the vehicle in here, and they had all of the data in there for that particular vehicle stored in the software. It's one of the best things I've ever seen. A lot of trouble to do it, I imagine. But you might remember I fixed an Eagle Talon that we put an engine controller on it, and the engine controller burned up right after we put it on there. It came in burned up, put another one on it burned up, and I used the sweep test function on this dynamic data collector. You know, rented a cable for $50 a day or whatever, put that on there, did a sweep test, and it pointed me exactly to the trouble. I didn't even know on that vehicle that the throttle position sensor could be shorted and could destroy the engine controller, but it did. And this thing right here pointed me at that. I love that tool. The only problem was I paid a lot of money for it. I think I paid like $9,000 for the tool and a couple of adapters for some of my freighter cars. But the following year, Snap-on took this out of production and quit updating the software and stuff. And so that was just that was a dirty deal. But other than the service bay diagnostic system Ford had, I've never seen anything that was as useful as this machine right here for finding really tough problems. This is a crappy video I took. You can't hardly read the numbers up here of this EGR testing. And what I did was, whenever that EVR was sending vacuum, and I was measuring a vacuum right here, you see, to the EGR valve, I noticed that the DPFE sensor was not changing. And that particular one was one of these. Now those early ones read 3.25 volts at rest. Look at how it was doing when it was supposed to. You put some percentage in there of EVR, like with your gas is a little bit under load, and you could tell that begins to respond. See that? And that was really cool how that worked out. Now, one of the things that I had started doing was they didn't have this published anywhere, but I would look at a good car and I'd tell them 3.25 on all the good cars. They had this kind of sensor, PFE sensor they call that one. Well, this one right here is called a DPFE because it's measuring pressure on both sides of an orifice in the EGR tube that's coming from the engine. And this other one down here, it works the same way. This one here reads 1 volt at rest. This one reads 0.6 volts at rest. So what I would tell you guys to do if you're working on a lot of different vehicles or a lot of vehicles that have got the same kind of stuff, measure with your voltmeter what these things are supposed to be reading at rest. Because I actually, when I started measuring voltages like that, and I got that information and I kept it in my mind, I could really quick measure that voltage, and if it was sitting there at rest reading, 2.1 volts or something, I knew right away this was bad. And so you know how that is, you get paid for your diagnosis, you get paid for the repair, so in about 10 minutes you earn 2 hours labor. These right here were easy to change too, the whole thing that you unplug the wires and pull it off the hose, but anyway. You ever seen one of these before? Some of the people I used to see used to tickle the crud out of me. This thing right here is whenever they build the transmission on some of the older Fords, they don't use these anymore, but they would stick this thing here in the dipstick hole to keep dust and crud out of it. And whenever they were putting the thing all together, they would just shove the dipstick in there, and that would push this piece on in there, and it would fall in the pan, and it would roll around into the pan until the first service. And I knew some of the guys that were doing services at the Ford place that didn't know why this was in there, and they would put it back in there. They thought that's what they needed to do. I thought that was so funny. It didn't hurt anything. It rolled around in there the whole time. But anybody that's seen one of these, the old school guys, is going to recognize this darn thing. Okay? Alright. Now, this right here is a Chrysler Crossfire story I got for you. It won't take long to tell it. She actually got a ride with one of the maintenance men. She says, my Chrysler quit about a quarter of a mile up the road from the school, and it just quit running. It's been doing that. I let it cool off, and then it'll drive a little more, and it quits again. So we got it over there, and when we went to get it, it started up. And we drove it back and let it run until it quit. And we pulled the code, and it had a crank sensor code. So we pulled the crank sensor out, and we used the heat gun to warm it up. And we measured while we were measuring the resistance, it had 1,050 ohms on this 2005 Chrysler Crossfire. And when you heated it up with a heat gun or a hairdryer or whatever, it would open up. And then when you let it cool off, it would come back. Well, that's a smoking gun right there. So I ordered an Intermotor brand. It comes from the parts store. It's $110. And so I measured the resistance just for grids, and it's got 1,350 ohms. I mean, it looks just like this one, except it's got the Intermotor part number on it. I said, I'm not sure I like this. But I put it in there, and with that 1,350 ohm sensor in there, that Crossfire might start and it might not. Beat all I've ever seen. So I said, well, got some issues here. So I rejected that one, sent it back to the parts store, got the other sensor, and I got this number off of it. And I put it in actually went to Amazon and put this number in, and the crank sensor for that thing came up on Amazon, and it was only like $35 for a Bosch sensor. Ordered it from Amazon, it came in, measured the resistance, it was exactly 1,050 ohms, put that sensor in there, never had another minute's problem with that car. Thanksgiving is coming. I hope you guys have a good one. This is going to go out on Monday of Thanksgiving week. And I hope you guys have a good week. If you do any work this week, I hope you do really well. And I'm going to sign off now, and there will be more for you next time.